It's time for another episode of Moving Offline, everybody. And today we're going to learn why you should delay smartphones. And we have Hannah Oertel with us because she is going to tell us all about it. Hannah, thank you very much for being here. Tell us a little bit more about yourself. Why should parents think about delaying smartphones?
Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, so I think that really the main reason that we want to delay smartphones is because there's so much evidence now that smartphones and social media causes harm to children, especially, also to adults, but especially to children. And I think that the first children who are given smartphones have now become adults. And so the sort of guinea pig generation, Gen Z or Gen Z, as you say, have reached adulthood, and we've seen just this huge crisis in their mental health and what's happened to them growing up with these extremely addictive devices. So whilst we'd love governments and big tech to change these platforms, make them safer for children, make them less addictive so that they can really have a real childhood, it's up to parents right now to make intentional, responsible decisions for their children. I think that a lot of parents will think it's almost like a rite of passage for their child to get a smartphone. When they start having that independence, when they start leaving the house more and going out on their own, they want to give them normally for Christmas or their birthday a smartphone. But actually, we like to sort of think of it as stepping stones, like we would with anything else. You know, you wouldn't go and give your 7-year-old a motorbike. They'd first go on a scooter and you'd be sort of pulling them along, and then they'd get a bike. And we want to sort of have the same thing with technology. So when they are showing that maturity and they are in need of that independence going out on their own, which I really encourage, then it's looking at, well, what device can they have first? Can they first go to a really simple phone? Because actually, a phone was devised to be able to help us communicate with people who we were not with in person. So calling, texting, that's a great thing. We want to be able to speak to our friends and family. And I think that's a good thing for kids to be able to do that. When I was younger, it was, phone boxes on every corner. I had a special card that I could type the code in that would call my parents' house. Everyone had a landline. But that is really a thing of the past now. So if we want our kids going to the park on their own, we need a way for them to be able to call home. And so to use a safe device, I think, is a really good thing. When we think of a smartphone, they're actually just so far away from a phone. They are that tiny computer in your pocket with instant access to the internet that's unsupervised. And so as parents, we want to be able to protect our children from all of those things and let them really have a real childhood.
Hannah, when I listen to what you're saying, is essentially the equivalent of training wheels. The idea is that, and I really appreciate it, by the way, as somebody who believes that dumb phones can be an excellent solution to regain some control, to start building habits once again. You're one of the few organizations that really pushes this idea of staggering instead of just going and saying, just have more willpower, just have a better engagement, increase your self-control, which it's important, but how can we do that when we have been hijacked, right? So I really appreciate that in your page, you have a few options for non-smartphones, and then you start progressing towards teaching the habits, teaching the ideas to the children, and then eventually maybe once they're ready, once they have an understanding of what this tool is for, then they can get a smartphone. I know last year with Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation, right? Massive book, super boom. Every parent was saying, okay, we're ready, ban smartphones, they're bad, they're hijacking our children. They are the equivalent of sending them to Mars, that first analogy on the book, which is an excellent book, by the way. But tell me a little bit more of the research. I want to understand, why is this approach of delaying, not saying we're going to ban them, we're going to completely saying no, but why is it so important to build up progression? And what are some of the habits that parents can teach throughout that progression?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first of all, in terms of looking at the harms, there's so much research now which is out there. So if we just look at, for example, physical health, the weight of a child's head is about 3 to 4 kilos. So most of the time when we're on our smartphones, we've got our heads down and we're looking down at our phones. So if you imagine that weight pulling down on a child's growing, developing spine, they're spending hours and hours a day in that position, which is an unnatural position. Everyone always wants to sit up straight after saying that. But I think that so we start to see things like this text neck and these problems with spinal damage, neck issues. Then our focus is supposed to change constantly throughout the day. That's how we've developed as humans. And so if you keep your focus at one point and don't change that focus for hours at a time, then what we're starting to see is a lot of children having problems with their eyesight and much more aged eyes than what they should have for their age. Then we look at sleep issues. We know that most kids are taking their smartphones into their bedrooms at night, which is, very dangerous in terms of the content they can be exposed to. But in terms of their sleep, it means that this constant distraction, they're checking notifications in the night. It's really difficult for them to get into that deep sleep because they are constantly being woken up. And also for parents, they might think their children are asleep, but they're actually just on their phones under the covers. In terms of the exercise they're getting, in terms of the movement, we are embodied beings. We want to be moving all the time, especially as children. And so if we then have something that's so addictive in our hands where we want to just stay in our rooms, stop going outside, stop actually interacting with our friends except through these online apps, that's very harmful, for our health. So that's just the sort of, the one physical side. Then if we look at things like mental health, in terms of things like comparisonitis, I like to think of girls, they'll be scrolling, they see other people, these lives, which they consciously know isn't real, they're sort of filtered lives, but their unconscious doesn't know the difference between that. So as soon as you start going on those apps, you start feeling worse about yourself. And then as you feel worse about yourself, it just makes you want to keep being on the apps more. So you get into a real vicious cycle. And then we know in terms of the exposure to things like suicidal content, self-harm content, the sexual content that kids get exposed to. And so even if we look at things like porn, it's changed so much in the last 10, 15 years. It's become so much more violent, so easily accessible. And so we know that from the top 50 porn sites, 87% of the videos on these sites have violence against women. So in the UK alone, we've got the second most common cause of stroke for women under 40 is strangulation during sex. So this kind of just very violent sex and porn that kids are seeing is just been completely normalized. And so you think for both boys and girls having, going into relationships, what they're experiencing isn't necessarily going to be healthy at all. And we've also got that kids being so exposed to this, especially for boys. I always think when I was younger, growing up in the sort of 90s, that you'd have school discos, the girls would be on one side, the boys would be on the other. And then eventually the boys would sort of start coming across and asking the girls to dance and things. But it was because really this was their first, sort of chance of being able to speak to girls and to be able to eventually end up having sex. They had to get out of their comfort zone. But when you've got now, especially with things like virtual reality, kids can just be at home. They can get all of those basic needs met without ever having to speak to the opposite sex. So in terms of, our whole humanity, what this means for the future, this is really, really serious. And then in terms of their social development, the amount of time we need to spend studying each other's faces to learn all of those micro expressions. You can tell if you walk into a room and someone's, a little bit irritated with you, we just get that feeling straight away. And so even though we might not be consciously aware of it, there'll be something in that micro expression that we're aware of. But if you haven't had those thousands of hours of studying people's faces, then you're not going to pick up on that stuff. And so you're losing your empathy, your compassion, your way, how you're going to communicate with people. And so we know that kids now, even when they're with each other in person, they'll be texting each other when they're sitting next to each other. You see groups of kids, they're all sitting around on their phones. But as I said earlier, the whole point of phones is to communicate with people who you're not with in person. So if you're together, the phone should be gone. And then we should be, with each other, enjoying each other's company. But that's unfortunately not what's happening. Of course, the academic performance, how they make us so distracted. As you were talking about, we've all been hijacked. And it's not our fault. There's nothing has ever been created, a device as addictive as this. And so we think, oh, I'm weak. I can't stop checking my phone. I just feel this compulsion to have to look at it all the time. And this is what we feel as adults. So if you had no experience of, growing up as a life without a smartphone, what chance have you got? Basically none. And I mean, I could talk about harms for hours. I'll sort of stop it there. But I think that for parents, of course, delaying is really, really important. But it's also important how we model our own behavior. And so I think that things I always say, like have a drawer in the kitchen. We have a charging drawer, so any devices, go in there in the evening, so we know we're sort of free from them for the night. But parents never letting your kids take their phones into their bedrooms at night. As parents, don't take your phones into your bedrooms. Get an alarm clock. They're about a fiver from Amazon. There's really no excuse to have your phone in your bedroom. Get a landline if you feel like you need to emergency make calls in the evening or from your room. Not having phones at a table, having meals. When your kids come to you to tell you something, especially when they're excited, these moments, we need to put our phones down and make eye contact with our children. They really feel this wall when we just hold our hands and don't look up from our phones, but sort of say, yeah, we're listening when we're not. So giving our kids that full attention and then having intentional time as a family without any phones, whether it's going out for a walk, going away, when you're on holiday, put your phones in the safe, trying to do as much as possible with everyone having no phones.
That's a lot of information. And it's a lot of concerning information at the same time, because you are not talking only about physical repercussions, but mental, social, emotional, psychological, and to a degree moral. So it's all encompassing. But something that I know about teenagers, something that I know about children is my friend has it. I want to be like my friend. I want to model not only after my parents, but after my peers. So, how do we bridge that gap? Is it important that, how do we form that community? Because I can think of a child saying, already hear it. I don't have children, but I already hear it in my future, 15 years from now, to whatever it is when I have children, is, but dad, my friends have it. I want it too. So, how do we meet that objection? How do we create community around it?
Yeah, which is really important because it is the number one pushback that you get from parents. I know people who really love this whole movement and are really passionate about it, and they've still given their 11-year-old smartphones, and so I think we have this fear of parents of our children being left out is too much for us to cope with. We just cannot sit in that discomfort of thinking they may experience this. So the first thing really is just as early as possible, starting to have these conversations with your children, talk about your family values, get them to notice in, a non-judgmental way, but just other people who are walking across the street holding a smartphone. Oh, look, they need to be careful. They could get hit by a car. When you're in a restaurant, when you're in a queue and everyone's on their phones, and just saying, oh, look, these people are missing out. Isn't it sad for them? And so starting to, just put that in as early as possible. And then I think that there's always going to be things, peer pressure. No matter what we do as parents, our kids are going to do probably a lot of things we'd really rather they didn't. But the difference here is that my parents would never have gone out and bought me a wrap of Coke. It's not something that would have happened. I might have tried to do that myself anyway, but I think that this is the situation that we've got here. This is something that we know now is extremely harmful for children. And yet it's parents that are buying it and giving it to their children, normally saying happy birthday. And so it's like, if we imagine that they were instead giving them razor blades and a video about how to self-harm, we'd be sickened by it. But I think that it's this sort of peer pressure argument it's really simple in a way, because yes, it's difficult, when we feel that. But if we as parents go, this is something that we know is really bad. It's something that we know is going to be harmful for you. But if everyone else is doing it, we're just going to do it too. And what is that message that they get for the rest of their life? It really is, even if it's dangerous, even if this sits really badly with you, even if this makes you lose your integrity, just do what everyone else is doing. And I think that's something that is bigger almost in a way than the smartphone issue, because it's like, who are you setting them up to be for the rest of their life? And so I think that it's okay to be different, teaching your kids, that we're going to stand by our values, and then finding those families who also agree with this. And I think that as time goes by, it just gets easier and easier to find other people who want to do this. You're not going to get everyone, and I think there is going to be a split. I've already seen articles saying how incredible virtual reality is going to be for education. And there are going to be classrooms where you walk in and they're all going to be wearing the Apple goggles. And it's going to be, makes me feel a bit sick, thought a bit, but it's going to happen. And so I think that this isn't a complete Luddite movement and just saying, oh, we're against all tech. A lot of tech can be great, but I think that the sort of argument of saying, oh, well, I can teach my kid how to use it safely, or I trust my child, this isn't something, it's not about trusting our kids. This is something that's incredibly harmful and dangerous. And so what do we really want for our kids? We want them to be healthy. We want them to be happy. We want them to be resilient and kind, contributing members of society. Giving them a smartphone young before they're able to handle what they're going to get, through that device, I don't believe it's the right thing to do, even if everyone else is doing it, because we will 100% look back with just horror and shame at what we allowed kids to be exposed to. And I think it's like, do you want to be on the right or wrong side of history here?
Smartphones are 15 years old, roughly. We have had them since roughly 2007. And some people could argue that even before that, in 2005, we had some capabilities, but they were not as distracting as they are today. They are not as all encompassing. They don't have all of this. They didn't have all of this information at the time. Instead, we have given them more and more information. And I could see the argument that virtual reality could be helpful, right? Augmented reality can help us teach and understand and visualize, while at the same time, with every new introduction of technology, there is an adjustment period in which we get to evaluate whether it's actually positive or negative for our development as human beings. And I think of the importance of children who may not have that understanding. If adults have a problem and they have a difficulty, children are more vulnerable than adults in this regard. So I know there is a lot of information out there, and you're trying to summarize it as much as possible so that it's digestible. Because I can think of a parent listening to the podcast right now and saying, I don't have time to keep up with all of these things. I don't have time to keep up with all of the research. How do I know what's safe? How do I know what's not safe? And things change as well throughout technology with so many different things, artificial intelligence, VR, AR. So how can they wrap their heads around it without being too overwhelming? Because I also have to keep up with my life. I have to go to work. I have to pay the bills. I have to do all of these things. So where can I find information that is digestible, helpful, and a community that supports me in this decision-making process?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, you were talking earlier about John Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. I think getting that on an audio book, if you don't have time to read it, and just starting to sort of chip away at that, I think can be really helpful. Also, when parents say, things change all the time, I don't know what to give my kid, I always say just road test it yourself first. So if you really want to give your kid Snapchat or something, just get it, set it up as them, use your kids' pictures if you want, and try it out for how much time you think they'll be using it on your lunch breaks, on the toilet if you have to, and I think just start to experience that app from their side, because that's the thing. Normally because of the algorithm, we will just see a platform in a very different way. Everyone's feed looks very different. And so parents who've tried that out for a week or two, almost every time will say, there's no way I'm giving that app to my child. But because they've never actually really tried it, they look over their shoulder, they're just watching a cooking video or some dance, and they think it's fine. So I think, yeah, doing that. On our site, so delaysmartphones.org.uk, we do sort of collate the research. It's not updated that often, but I think it still gives you, the kind of overview of what's going on with smartphones. And then it's really about having these conversations with your child's sort of friends, parents, with those families, and finding those people who just said, you know what, I'm concerned about this. Even just saying to people, have you seen this site? I'm feeling really worried about this for my child. Are you too? And as I said, not everyone will be. Some people will be like, oh, it's fine. I think this is just a load of nonsense, moral panic. But other people will say, yeah, I know what I'm like with my own phone, how addicted I am. I'm concerned about this for my child. And so if you just have 5 other families and you say together, no matter what, we're not going to give our smartphones and our kids smartphones until at least the age of 14, ideally 16. And then say, let's just use alternative devices in the meantime. And then, they get that smartphone when they need it for their banking or their parking apps or travel apps or whatever it is. And I think that's the thing often as adults, there are more sort of utility reasons why we'll have a smartphone, which children really don't need, at this point. If you feel like, whatever you want the smartphone for them, there are always ways to get around it. Just sometimes needs a little bit more intention. And the amount of parents that I've spoken to who just said, if only we could go back, if only we could go back and just not have given him the phone when he was 10, if only we could have done that. And then unfortunately, it's too late. And unfortunately, there's so many situations where children have died or just have had, horrendous things happen to them and they've really sort of lost them. And I always think of that phrase of when you want your child's childhood to end, give them a smartphone. And it really is that we're just sort of handing them over to the internet. And is that what how we want our children to be brought up?
One last area that I'd like to explore is your understanding of how this technology is helpful for certain kids. And I'm talking about more different abilities or kids that may have a speech impediment. And this is a lifesaver for their social life, their understanding. I mean, these advancements have been helpful, but also I want to understand what is the age, if this technology is helpful for kids with impediments or without, but what is the appropriate age to start introducing, you know, even the first step, a basic phone, towards the final step, which is a more regulated experience with the smartphone.
Yeah. So in terms of a device which is really necessary, whether it's, things like as a medical device or as some things, like you said, if someone's got a speech impediment, I really think of that as something very different. What we're talking about here is kids being completely addicted to WhatsApp, social media, that sort of scrolling and just nonsense and harmful content. If you have a child with diabetes, of course they're going to they need to have a smartphone. This isn't about that. There's always going to be exceptions, and I think we can all see that in a sort of logical way that this is really not what this is about. You can have a phone that only has the diabetes app or whatever on it, and that's going to be fine for that child. And so whatever age they need that, I would say they can have that. But in terms of when should they get a brick phone, I would just say it's at the time that you want them to start going out of the house alone. Personally, not all parents, think that. I think it can be something that can really encourage and enhance independence. My kids were going out on their own from quite a young age, going on buses and doing things. And I think they had that security that if something went wrong, which sometimes it did, they could call me and say they've not got their money or whatever it is. So again, that's like as families, when you think they're ready to do these things, it also depends on the area that you live in. But I think children generally are overprotected. I think it was the stat, you have to leave your child, outside alone in the front garden for 14 million years for them to be kidnapped. So this stuff is quite rare, again, depending where you live. But I think that a lot of people sort of listening to this, we live in quite privileged areas and it is probably quite safe. I don't want to say, because I know people are going to get angry with me about that. But I think that, we just tend to be very paranoid about kids going to parks on their own, walking to school on their own, when, eventually they're going to need to do this. So, and think back to what we did, at that age. And yeah, in terms of, when they get a smartphone or when they do eventually get these things, I think it really comes down to the needs that when they require it. For my kids, I definitely want to hold out as long as I possibly can and then look at their maturity. So what's their maturity like with other devices? If they have an iPad and you say, okay, this is the time you're going to watch it for, are they able to turn it off and, put it away? What are they like with the TV? What are they like with gaming? If they're, okay and mature with all of that stuff, then you can start to give them more. But you also need to be thinking when you're giving them that stuff, you need to be able to be having these conversations, talking to them often about sextortion, about porn, about their data, about, scamming, about, and a lot of parents are not ready to have these kinds of conversations with their child and want to sort of wait until that, until they feel more mature. So this is the stuff they're going to be seeing online. And I think that, it's sort of, they need to go hand in hand, really.
Hannah, thank you very much. I think you have given us an overview. And of course, there's more to understand from parents and from personal ideologies. Just a whole understanding of this is extremely important. I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell people how they can find your work on delay smartphones and more ideas on this. And also, please give us a final word, something that you want to leave the audience with.
Thank you. Yeah. So as I said, we have the pledge on the website, which is delaysmartphones.org.uk, where you can commit to delay until at least the age of 14. And I would say, sign that with some of your peers, with your friends, do it together. I also have the Substack, which is Delay Smartphones. And there I write sort of more in depth about pushback that I get from parents or, things that they're concerned about. And I think, that can be helpful. And final thought. I think it was someone said to me, we spend 80% of our time with our children before they're 12. It's really a short amount of time, that we have with our kids where they actually want to hang out with us. And I know for me, that's not something I want to speed up to just get rid of them, because I feel like, this is a short amount of time in our lives. And so I think for all of us, it's just thinking, how can we support our children and hold on to them so they can have, the best life, be resilient and kind. And I think that, this is something that is going to really help them in life.
That was Hannah Oertel with Delay Smartphones in the UK. If you want to find more of her work, there will be links in the description below. Thank you for listening to Moving Offline today. We hope this conversation helped you understand a little bit more about how you can have these conversations with your children or even friends. I think this is quite an important body of work, and I'm really excited to see it flourish. Go out there, contact Hannah if you have any extra questions, and look at the resources that she has on the website. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Thank you for listening to Moving Offline. I just want to remind you, if you want to support the podcast, there are 2 links there in the description as well. And also give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you're enjoying the show. Thank you for your listenership. We really appreciate it. And hopefully this year we can build better communities, we can build better alternatives so that people can get back to living their lives. Thanks again. We'll see you in the next podcast.